All right, as I mentioned, um, this stuff is supplemental in the sense that I'm not going to test you on this or anything, uh, but I did include it in the lecture notes, and it was in the PowerPoint, so I might as well talk about that here. I did do this slide in class, but just a reminder that scientists are only human. So when talking about the nature of science, it's worth mentioning that individual and personal, prejudices and biases and so forth can influence the way people come to conclusions. Ideally, it shouldn't. Ideally, it should be a rational decision made based only on the evidence, but scientists are only human. Humans are subject to these sorts of emotions and feelings. It happens. So I wanted to give a couple cases of sort of spectacular problems that showed up in paleontology due to some of these personal issues. The first one's going to have to do with personalities, and the second one has to do with national prejudices. So the first of these is what's called the Bone War, and it was an episode in the history of vertebrate paleontology, so the study of animals with fossil backbones, in the late 19th century in the American West. It had to do with the fact that the two leading vertebrate paleontologists in North America at the time, Othniel Charles Marsh from Yale and Edward Drinker Cope, who wasn't affiliated with a particular institution but operated out of Philadelphia, that these two people really didn't get along well. They actually started off as not unfriendly to each other and sort of alone in a world where there weren't a lot of paleontologists at the time. Um, they started off relatively, on good terms. In fact, they would go to each other's digs on occasion back in the East. But they were both egotists. And because of that, they ran into a bunch of problems as time went by. Now, much of their problems had to do with discoveries out in the American West. These folks were operating in the 1870s through the 1890s, so the time that the Western territories and eventually Western states were opening up in terms of more easy access. The railroads had gone through, and people were beginning to explore sites. This happens to be a site in Wyoming, Bighorn Basin of Wyoming. You can't see them, but these little dots here, those are human beings right here. So the rest of these are bushes, but those two are little human beings. This was a site we worked at in with the Smithsonian back in the 90s. But same general region. So from Montana and Wyoming and Colorado and Nebraska and the Dakotas, down to a little further south, that's where Cope and Marsh had conflicts. Now, they themselves occasionally would go out west. Here's O.C. Marsh with what Yale students and actually field workers looked like. But for the most part, it was teams. It would be a couple, maybe people that they hired to oversee the digs, and then a number of local people who might be hired to help out on the digs would go out there and collect fossils, dinosaurs, mammals, and so forth. Now, the advantage of this competition between the two of them was that a vast fraction of our knowledge of what dinosaurs and large fossil mammals from the Cenozoic looked like came, especially from North America, came from the work of these individuals. It was through these guys that we found out what horned dinosaurs looked like, and plated dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, long-necked plant eaters. Bits and pieces of them had been found before, but the first complete skeletons showed up. Duckbill dinosaurs, the first skulls of duckbill dinosaurs, complete meat-eating dinosaurs for the first time, etc., came out of their work. So in that sense, the competition drove people to acquire more material. But the competition also drove people to duplicate their efforts. As I mentioned, part of the aspect of science is getting a priority for something. And one thing that's important to get priority for is names of species and also ideas, but names of species. So whoever finds something, describes it, and names it properly first, that name has priority. We'll talk about that in class on Tuesday. Well, since, your main fame in the discovery aspect is new species, both Cope and Marsh tended to name new species very quickly, and sometimes they wound up naming the same thing multiple times, either Cope naming the same thing twice, having discovered part of it once, and then another example of the species later on, but trying to outcompete Marsh, would name it twice. Or Cope would find it and name it something, and Marsh would find it and name it a different thing, even though it was the same thing. And it was the work of paleontologists in the 20th century to sort of sort out all the mess that had done. In that aspect, it wasn't horrible, it's competition and so forth. But the Bone War, as it was called, got a little messier. On occasion, they would each of their teams would hire members of some of the local native communities out there to harass the other team. Not to kill them, not to assassinate them, but just to harass them, to slow down their digs. They would try to pay people to conspire from the opposing person's team, and get the information to the person paying the money first. So working to undermine the other one. And because there was government and money involved, in particular on the part of Marsh, who was the first official paleontologist, at least vertebrate paleontologist, for the U.S. Geological Survey, which was then a brand new institution in the Department of Interior, that other people said, hey, guys, you got to cool it. You're using government funds to do research. You can't be acting like a couple of jerks. And so there were congressional committees that came up about this. And of course, each one trying to feed their pet congressman tidbits about the other person. So yeah, it wasn't a good look. Then here's another case, a 20th century case, a famous one. You may have heard about it before. Maybe you've heard the phrase "Piltdown Man" before, even though if you don't know what the issue was. Now, as we'll talk about when I talk about human origins later in the course, there was a model that was common in the 19th century into the dawn of the 20th century, that brains are what made us us. That is what made humans distinct from all other animals. So the thought was the big brains would show up first, and then an upright stance would come later on. And a more modern style jaws would come later on, and so forth. And in fact, this still permeates popular culture. You still have this idea of these hunched over, knuckle walking early humans. As we'll see, that's not the pattern of actual evolution. But that was the thought of the early part of the 19th century. Also, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were no British fossil humans. The Germans had Neanderthals. The French had the Cro-Magnons. The Belgians had found fossils. The Spaniards had found fossils. The Portuguese and so forth. But not the British. And so, this is the height of sort of national pride between these different countries, and the Brits felt bad. So, it turned out in 1912, a collector of fossils and artifacts brought forth to the scientists at the British Museum discoveries of a big-brained fossil human from the region of Piltdown. And the stuff that's in dark is what was represented by fossils. So part of the brain case and the lower jaw. And in fact, this was so distinctive that a paleontologist named it after the guy who had found them and called it Eoanthropus, so the dawn human, the human of dawn, of the dawn, Dawsoni, after Dawson, the collector of the fossil. Well, it turned out he wasn't the collector of the fossil, he was a hoaxer of the fossil. What Dawson had done, is created a hoax to play upon this this idea of the lack of a British early human, and therefore he would get them to buy these specimens from them. And so what he did is he took a medieval human skull, so a modern human being. He took a old but not super ancient orangutan jaw, which he filed off part of. So you can see it actually is not really articulating with the upper part of the skull. The connection point had been filed off. And there were some isolated teeth he had too, which were actually the only fossil parts of the whole thing. They were fossil chimp teeth. And he claimed he discovered them. Well, he didn't do any such thing. He didn't dig them up out of the ground. He made them in his own, back room lab. But he brought them to the museum, and because they really wanted a British fossil and they wanted confirmation of the big brain hypothesis, they weren't as skeptical as they should have been about this material. Okay, I shouldn't exaggerate that. There were people from the 19 teens who already questioned the legitimacy of Piltdown Man. It's not that everyone accepted it, but enough people accepted it that it was part of sort of the standard interpretation of human origins until the 1950s. And then what happened is early forms of chemical analysis. So these aren't, this wasn't initially radiocarbon, it was other types of analyses. But they showed that the different parts of the specimen were radically different ages from each other. People looked at the specimen, discovered they had been stained these colors. They weren't these colors because of fossilization, but someone had coated them with dyes and so forth, and the hoax was revealed. It turns out Dawson, this isn't the only case of hoaxes. He had hoaxed artifacts before about, Roman times or medieval times and so forth, and this was just the most famous of the hoaxes he made. So it wasn't a scientist who made it, it was a hoaxer who made it. But the scientists fell for the hoax because this discovery conformed to their previous beliefs. Remember, science is what we do to keep from lying to ourselves. And so these guys, they were kind of lying to themselves. They weren't following through in the applied skepticism that is science. And this is actually, there's the actual specimens. That's the brain case parts. There's the lower jaw, and there's the one part that's a fossil tooth. Okay, so that's it for this little diversion. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will see you in class. Take care.